Welcome. Today I'm going to do something a little different, which is to share what I know about the history of tarot with you, and my little sidekick Spasmo is going to help in his own special way. And in preparing to do this, actually, I discovered something that I find really interesting. There are many different kinds of tarot, and there are many different ways to interpret what tarot is for, or what it's about, or why we read tarot in the first place. So I think actually that is where I would like to start, because for me, tarot is a way of gaining insight into a situation. It's not all that different from opening a favorite book of wisdom from any tradition, any religion, any cultural background, and just randomly opening to a page and seeing where your eyes light on the page and using that for guidance, using that as a new lens to look through to help clear your vision of what's going on in your life. It's not meant to tell you what to do, ever, because we have free will. So really, the whole point of being human is taking responsibility for our choices and for our decisions, and for looking into those choices and those options and decisions so that we can make the best possible choice with the information and resources we have at the time. And always, when you look back, you have different resources or different knowledge, so the way of judging a past decision is never absolutely fair. At the same time, you still have to take responsibility for the decisions that you have already made. And sometimes all that means is, okay, now I'm going to make a different choice. Or, wow, I think I want to research that some more. Or, that sort of thing. And so when I'm looking at tarot or when I'm reading the cards, what I'm really trying to do is gain more insight, gain more information, or create space for a breakthrough of understanding that you might not have had if you went with just what you knew at the moment. It's not meant to replace research and factual information. It's meant to augment that by also looking at what's in our hearts and looking at our patterns in our lives and why we have those patterns, and being conscious of whether or not we want to continue those patterns. So about, 7 or 8 years ago, I taught a workshop on the history of tarot. And I actually found a program in my computer that was able to translate my notes from that workshop 7 or 8 years ago into whatever program my computer has on it now. And then I gathered up all the materials that I have on hand should I ever give that workshop again. And I have a lot of materials. A couple of the things that I have that I used for the first workshop include my personal favorite tarot deck and book. This is the one that I started with and that came to me in a really wonderful way, which is a different story. And this book is really about self-improvement. In fact, it's called The Medicine Woman Inner Guidebook, A Woman's Guide to Her Unique Powers. And really, it's about improving, self-improvement. And something that I just enjoyed so much and was tickled by when I first got this deck and the book here, the book and the deck together, was in one of the introductions after the legal disclaimers. There's a paragraph in the chapter called The Circle Continues, and it says, "Once upon a time, long ago, the people of high consciousness observed that the world was beginning to be overrun by people unable to perceive the wholeness. There was a danger that the almighty powers that were meant to be used for the good of all would annihilate the planet if the knowledge of the laws of nature were to be known by those without a love for her. So the high ones, in their cleverness, condensed all of these laws and great teachings into images that fit on 78 cards, and they gave the cards to wanderers whom no one would suspect of carrying the ancient wisdom. We called the wanderers gypsies, and the deck of cards the tarot, a word that means rota, the wheel or circle, orat, speaks, Torah, the law, ator, of nature. The gypsies played the cards of life as they traveled, and through the images the truths were passed to minds that were open to receive them. To the receptive minds who gazed upon the gypsies' tarot, there came inspiration to walk in greater harmony, coming into conscious union with creation. Through time, the earth has given every land a tribe of people who see the wholeness. The whole people live the knowledge that all creatures are their sisters and brothers. The winds and rains, the sun and moon, the rocks and waters, these too they understand to be their relatives. Through their visions they have come to see that this way is the keeping of paradise upon the land. And I took with me from the very first time that I looked into tarot this idea that it was this great wisdom that had been condensed into these 78 cards. And that it came from the people that we call gypsies. And boy, that name is so ingrained in me. I really want to call them by the more respectful name, because really the term gypsy is very similar to other nicknames that have been given, say, to African American Black people when we called them by other names. And it's just not very respectful. And it's got a connotation to it that isn't very nice. So I much prefer to call them by their more respectful title. But the problem is that my memory never gives me that name without a whole lot of time spent trying to remember what they were called. And so I apologize, but I cannot come up with the correct name right now. Anyway, that said, so another resource that I now have that I did not have at the time that I gave the workshop before is this book called The Tarot of the Bohemians. And this book, I don't know if you can even, you can kind of see that there's this incised, the circle and all of that on the front of this. This book is called The Absolute Key to Occult Science, The Tarot of the Bohemians, the most ancient book in the world for the use of initiates, by Pappas, translated by A.P. Morgan, 2nd edition, revised with preface by A.E. Waite. And the date on this book is 1919. Now, I have something on my face. It's bugging me. Most of us, when we start looking into tarot, the first deck that we learn about, and the deck that is considered the most prestigious, the oldest deck that we have access to today, is the Rider-Waite deck. And I'm just going to point out to you, W-A-I-T-E. And so I started to read all of the different introductions that are in this book because it's been translated and retranslated. And I used to be a reference librarian. So one of the things that I know, especially because I used to also have a love of words, come to me, please. Archaeology and anthropology. Oh, the Romany people. The Romany people are the ones that are credited with the tarot deck and with being keepers of this ancient knowledge and this ancient way. The Rider-Waite deck, I have the book here, is considered the pictorial key to the tarot. And A.E. Waite, or Waite, is the primary author of these books. And this deck is a deck that has been around since basically, I believe he's credited with putting it together in the 1940s. But considering that he made his translation of tarot in the 1919 originally, I'm not sure about the dates for that. And the history in the book that I have is very similar to the history that I found online 8 years ago, talking about tarot. And the history of tarot is this, according to these two sources, which are probably the same source. Back in the late 1300s, the late 14th century, and I'm kind of reading off of my notes now, so forgive me. Here's what it says. Playing cards first entered Europe in the late 14th century, probably from Egypt, with suits very similar to the tarot suits that we have today, of swords, staves, cups, and coins, or discs or pentacles. And the most traditional decks that we find are still used in Italy, Spain, and Portugal, apparently. The first documentary evidence is a ban on the use of tarot cards in 1367 in Switzerland. Wide use of playing cards in Europe can be traced with some certainty from 1377 onwards, and the first known tarot cards were created between 1430 and 1450. However, we have old texts that refer back to tarot figures in 1300. So that far back at least, there have been some sort of tarot cards in circulation. And the reason that I bring up archaeology and anthropology is that back in the early 1900s, when finding dead things and bringing them back to your country for display was popular, and the 1800s and the 1700s, the scientific method wasn't really in use, and there was not an understanding of the information that the soil around each found object contained, or the location of each object in relation to each other. And things that were not either dead-wrapped mummies or gold were considered kind of pointless and were just sort of thrown aside, and actually had more damage done to them in the process of archaeology at the time. And my favorite college archaeology class, the professor talked a lot about how even today, everything that we extract, all of the stories that we tell from what we find in archaeology and anthropology, are told through the lens of our own understanding. So he had us read some of the earlier archaeology books and the finds that are the basis of much of what we understand about, say, ancient Egypt or most ancient cultures. And he had us look at who wrote those books, those papers, those texts. And it became so clear that, my favorite story was this. There was a rock. There was a rock found. It looked like the sides had been broken off, so it might have been part of a larger rock at some point, and it had a couple of squiggles chiseled into it. And the person who found it decided that that was a representation of the god of water, the Poseidon of that area of the world, and the worship of that god there. And it just so happens that that person who made that decision about what that squiggle on that rock meant was a white Christian man. And he was looking through his own understanding of what would be important what would be culturally important to people based on what was culturally important to him. And so unless he explains exactly how he came to that conclusion and gives us all of the evidence that is actually scientific, it's a theory. It's a theory that he is presenting as a fact, that those squiggles on that rock represent whatever the equivalent of Poseidon was in that part of the world, a male god. They could just as easily have represented a female goddess, since so many of the older cultures saw water as female. And the deities that lived in water or were related to water were primarily female for thousands of years. It was actually only fairly recently in our history that the majority of deities became male in our world. And so, that squiggle, it could even have been like, hey, look out for the rapids. If you get into the water here, it could have been fields full of plants, for all we know. Who knows what those were? So I always find it interesting when I come across a book from the 18 and 1900s that claims to have done research factually, because I'm never really sure where that information came from and how they got to the conclusion that they did, because all they present is the theories. They don't actually even present the original find, like the rock with the squiggle on it, that made them come up with that theory. So according to Arthur, there's all of this proof that these tarot cards date back to the 1300s. And there's all of this proof of what those tarot cards mean and how they were intended to be used. And it became a very, very popular book and text and set of cards that we still use today. And in fact, he's very clear about the distinctions between the greater and lesser arcana, for example. And I'll explain what those are as well. But first, back to the history of tarot. Other regional styles of tarot include the Swiss tarot. Basically, the cards used to all be major arcana. And so I guess I'd better explain what that actually is now. Can you tell how organized I am? When you look at a deck of cards, you have some that are considered major, and some that are considered minor. And for example, I'm looking at different tarot decks here to try and give you a good example, and I don't have a very good example in front of me right now. But basically, what used to be tarot actually became playing cards at one point because the church objected to them being considered wisdom and to the fact that they had religious figures on them. And so all of the religious or wise figures were removed from the major arcana of the tarot deck. And we were left with 4: the kings, the queens, the jacks, and the aces. And what's interesting is that the ace itself, in current modern playing card decks, can be the largest card, the smallest card. It can be the 0 or the 20, but it can also be the wild card, the one that you can put anywhere and it works, depending on the game that you're playing with your traditional, what we think of as traditional deck of cards with the 4 suits in it. Well, tarot also has 4 suits in it, but it has 22 kings, queens, and major arcana, and not just 4. And instead of the ace, it has the 0 card, or the fool. And the fool is the only person in the entire court who can tell the king when he's wrong and get away with it and live. You never know for sure if he'll live, but he is considered so completely innocent and blind to the niceties of life that he can say things directly to the person in power that no one else can say, because he doesn't know any better. But the fool, the wise fool, is also someone who knows how much power he has and takes that risk understanding exactly the impact of what he is saying. So you get both sides with that card. You get the least important person in the court, in the king's court, or in the deck, and you get the most powerful, the most capable of changing the outcome of something that the king or the queen or the court has decided. But the other interesting thing about the fool is that the fool steps forward blindly. The fool herself or himself never knows what the outcome is actually going to be. They just keep taking the step. And so all of the decks have the fool, all traditional decks show the picture of someone who doesn't have a lot of money, doesn't have any resources, is out there on their own, about to step off a cliff. And if I'd really been thinking, I would have put this in order so that I had one in front of me, but I didn't. So anyway, I have the Aquarian Tarot, and there you go, there's a fool right there. Because it's a traditional deck, because it follows the rules of the Rider-Waite deck, and because you can use these cards to, and this book to interpret what you draw from this deck, the Rider-Waite. So for example, here's the Chariot. It's number 7. You can see the number right here. And so it's a little bit like having, you know, you have the 4 suits, you have the jacks, or the hearts and the diamonds and all of that. Well, it's almost like having a 5th suit when you're playing with a full deck, when you're playing with a tarot deck, except that the 5th suit, everybody's in the court. They're all major. And what they are is archetypes of steps in power, or steps in self-awareness, or steps in enlightenment. And speaking historically, again, one of the things that happened over time is that as the church gained in power, they didn't want any non-Christian representations in the deck. And then the church gained in power again, and they didn't want any powerful female figures in the deck. And then they changed again, and they didn't want any religious figures in the deck because it was a secular deck and because it was blasphemy, which is how we ended up with our modern playing cards. And some people can still give you a very, very good tarot reading from a traditional modern deck of cards. I'm not one of those people. But the number, I showed you the number, so we'll look that up. It was a Major Arcana. The Chariot is, so the numbers happen within each suit, but they also happen, each Major Arcana has a number. And so that was the Chariot, the Major Arcana number 7. So I'm going to look up if I can find it in the Rider-Waite, the Rider deck here. Number 7 in the Major Arcana, the Chariot. Excuse me. Holy schmoly, I should have looked this up ahead of time. All right, here we go. Well, there's the Lovers. I'm close. All right, the Chariot. Woohoo! Here's a picture of the Chariot. An erect and princely figure carrying a drawn sword and corresponding, broadly speaking, to the traditional description which I have given in the first part. Arthur has given in the first part. On the shoulder, okay, so there's the description. Well, I can't find that right now. Okay, so it's about the mystery of nature, because there's a sphinx in there, and not the world of grace, which... All right, come on. What I really want is, so they must have it twice. And here we go. The Chariot. The brief description here in the back on page 284 is that the chariot represents succor, one of the few words I cannot pronounce. Basically that means help and aid in a time of need. Providence, also war, triumph, presumption, vengeance, and trouble. And that's just the good meaning. So every tarot usually has a good meaning and a bad meaning, or like the positive meaning and the negative meaning. And the negative meaning is usually called the reversed meaning. So the reversed meaning for the Chariot is riot, quarrel, dispute, litigation, and defeat. So I'm really glad that when I first came across tarot, I actually did not come across this deck, because almost everything in it is negative. And is about the worst possible outcome, even the non-reverse stuff, quite frequently. And yet it gives great readings, and it's been around for, almost 100 years now, or 100 years now, practically. And they claim to be traditional. They claim to be based on the absolute original, earliest thing that Arthur could come across in his historical research back in 1919. So I'm going to also then show you the Great Mystery, the Major Arcana of my Medicine Woman book. Number 5 is the Peacemaker interfacing with the world. Oh, that's not number 5 that we want. We want number 7, excuse me. Number 7, the Warrior, the Victorious Warrior. Let's go on to that. And this picture, they actually, for this deck, draw from a variety of spiritual traditions around the world, including Native American, including Christian, including really a wonderful variety. And this one happens to have a depiction of a Native American person on a horse with a rainbow, and what could be a traditional drum or possibly a traditional shield with a moon and a star and some feathers. And there's also an eagle in the picture. So this is number 7, the Warrior, which the meaning is rest and success. The traditional name is Chariot, and the Medicine Woman energy is Victorious Warrior. The affirmation for this Major Arcana card is, I am a point of power for the divine plan which works unfailingly through me. Having set my will to follow the highest within, I am strengthened to express the victorious life. There's like 3 or 4 pages of information and exercises in this book having to do with that particular card. If it comes up for you, it's a little bit like getting a really strong message, like it's having something highlighted in bold with stars on your phone. Like, pay attention to this. The Minor Arcana give similar messages, but they are a little bit less forceful and a little bit more fine-tuned, I find. So when I do a tarot spread, quite frequently, the Major Arcana is where we spend most of our time, and the Minor Arcana are simply either acknowledgments or, just giving a hint towards something that isn't necessarily quite as vital to what we're talking about that time. That said, with all these changes that have happened over the years in who's in the cards, who are the Major Arcana, the history talks about the fact that Juno and Jupiter, there used to be a Papus, there used to be a female pope as one of the Major Arcana, and that eventually became the High Priestess. And before it was the Papus, it was actually Juno, which is a Greek goddess, or a Roman goddess, actually. And so then you also had Jupiter, and you had the Pope, which eventually became the Hierophant, or the wise man, when you couldn't have actual religious figures in there anymore. So you can kind of see this shift happening. The Papus actually became the High Priestess, and Although many decks removed the High Priestess because it was a female in power, at least she wasn't on par with a pope. She wasn't a papist. In Florence, there was an expanded deck called the Minciati, which had 96 cards and included astrological symbols for the 4 elements, as well as traditional tarot motifs. And here's a bit on the High Priestess. The High Priestess tarot card was originally called La Papessa, or the Popess. The card first appeared in the 15th century, so the 1400s. Some of the cards directly linked the woman on the cards to the papacy by showing the woman wearing the papal tiara. And in fact, if you didn't know this, there were female priests and female popes and very high-level female leaders of religion, even within Christianity, very early on. It was only later that those things were stripped away. And actually, it was interesting also that in the beginning, the very beginning, before the Bible was actually written, there were women in places of power within Christianity and in the religions prior to Christianity, and then they were removed and it became a man's game or a man's spiritual pursuit to be the leader. And then more recently we've started adding positions back in and allowing women to hold positions with a little bit more power within certain Christian traditions again. And I find that fascinating. We have this kind of wave theory going on over thousands of years and hundreds of years. There are also variants on the Pope, the High Priestess, which along with the papal tiara show keys to the kingdom that are a traditional symbol of the papacy. All right, so in the earliest tarot decks, the Fool is usually pictured as a beggar or a vagabond. He wears ragged clothes, stockings without shoes. He carries a stick on his back. His unruly beard and his feathers may relate to the tradition of wood woes or the wild man. Another early Italian image that relates to the tradition is the first and lowest of the series of the so-called Tarocchi of Mantegna. This series of prints containing images of social roles, allegorical figures, and classical deities begins with Misero, a depiction of a beggar leaning on a staff. Or there's, oh my gosh, it's German. I cannot pronounce it. It's a barefoot man in robes, apparently with bells on his hood, playing a bagpipe. So as I said, you have these traditional archetypes that existed prior to certain Christian traditions, and then you have the Christian traditions taking those in and turning them into something they could recognize. So you have a system where there's basically members of the court, members of the king's court, and we sort of stuck with that because we removed the spiritual element almost entirely and got the playing cards with the king's court and all of the king's men and the queen and all of that. The tarot, let's see. Most tarot decks originally made for game playing do not assign a number to the Fool, indicating its rank in the suit of trumps. It has none. There's also the World. In my favorite deck of cards, the World is actually number 21. It is the highest of the Major Arcana. It's like sitting on top of the world. You made it. You are enlightened. In older decks, these are usually a human face or a head, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. And the symbols are the 4 evangelists, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. They also have representative symbols on those same cards. They're very ornate cards of the 4 directions, the 4 elements, the 4 decks, the 4 suits of cards. There's a lot going on in that particular deck card, Major Arcana card. It also holds reference to the vision of Ezekiel of the throne or chariot of God in the Old Testament. In later centuries, the church felt it was inappropriate for commoners to play with their spiritual leaders. They also didn't like the meaning of some of the cards because the actual Pope was not number 21 in the deck. He was actually, I believe, number 4. But we can look that up because I have the deck right here, and we'll look it up because I could be wrong. Yeah, I think he was number 4. I think I actually got that right. Looking for number 4. The Seeker was the High Priestess. She was number 2. Bounty was the Empress, number 3. Number 4 was Command, the Emperor. Number 5, he was number 5, the Peacemaker. The traditional name was the Hierophant, which we now also know was the Pope prior to that. Meditation, mediation, the peacemaker interfacing with the world. I am the mediator between my God self and my world. I bring the within outward, recognizing that my presentation and the world's response are just. I am at peace with all outcomes. I am the guiding voice speaking to you from within your heart. So anyway, what we have these days are symbols, and we have different formats for those symbols and different formats even for tarot. So you have tarot cards that have the 22 major arcana and then the 4 suits, and it totals the 70-some cards. But then you also have decks like this one. I really like the Wisdom of the Crone deck here. And it doesn't have suits at all. It just simply has individual cards. And so here's Earth. And Earth, the card says, in an endless cycle, the feminine, as ancient and eternal as nature, constantly rebirths herself. Come into the motion of the origin of all things. Come, be rocked and lulled by the mother deep. Remember to nourish her as she nourishes you. This one also has wonderful cards like security and magic. And so this is a really great one because the information that you need in order to do a reading with this deck is printed on the card itself. Here's creativity. Yeah, creativity. And you don't have to worry about major and minor and upright and reversed and all of those details. You just pull a card and say, what does this card tell me? So I am pulling loss, because even though the Rider-Waite seems heavily weighted towards the negative, there are difficulties in life, in real life, and they have a place. It's just that they're not everything. Loss. As you walk the path of loss, know that grief deepens you. Losing someone you love is your loss, your pain. Although you will miss them, know that they are on to the next great adventure. Tincture of time soothes sorrow. Dwell on living. You can find a tarot deck with almost any theme as its function. Like this one is the Wisdom of the Crone. I have one that's all about cats. I have several that are from trees and plants and herbs and the wisdom that those can bring to us. I have several that are animal decks. Let's see. One of my favorites for that is actually the medicine cards from Jamie Sams. So here you have animals. So for example, 26 is the squirrel. Gathering. Squirrel teaches you to plan ahead for winter when the trees are bare and the nuts have long since disappeared. Squirrel medicine can come in many forms, as this furry creature is very diverse in nature. The erratic behavior of squirrel has bested many a forlorn hunter, and it thus stands to reason that there are benefits to being able to circle a branch at lightning speed. This erratic behavior of squirrel can also get nerve-wracking if you are dealing with persons who have squirrel medicine. Trying to calm them down enough to accomplish something may drive you nuts. At the end of each of these, she gives usually, oh, that's interesting. So she gives, I'm looking for one that has what I'm used to. Well, she gives a contrary at the end of each one. So she'll give a reading and then a contrary. Oh, I know. I'm thinking of, I have an actual more traditional wisdom Native American deck that I love and use, but is not right in front of me. And it gives information about the symbol, and then it gives, if this card has come to you, here's what it probably means, and then it gives a contrary. So here's another version, the Woman's Book of Guardians. I love this because it brings guardians like Artemis, for example, from ancient Greek tradition, the bear from animals. Almost all shamanic healers at some point come into contact with bear, the great nurturer, the great healer. So anyway, lots of different ways to go about doing tarot and lots of interesting history that comes with tarot. And yeah, this has probably gotten really long, but it's really fun and it's such a big topic. I'm sure I'll come back to it at some point. With that, I look forward to talking with you again soon. If you have questions, please put them in the comments. I'd be happy to answer them if I know, and if I don't know, I can at least make a suggestion and let you know that I have no clue. Blessings on your journey.